Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Tax Talk, broadcast by the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. My name is Jordan Bateman, and I'm the British Columbia Director of the CTF. And I'm joined, as always, by our Alberta Director, Paige McPherson. Miss Paige, how are you doing?
I am doing so well, and especially so well to know that in Ottawa it is cold and snowy, and here in Calgary and there in Vancouver and even in Saskatchewan it's warm and sunny, 24 degrees. God, it sucks to be in the capital city.
The West is bad.
If I wanted to, I could call an Uber ride right now, so I still have freedom.
Okay, you got me there.
All right. So no one's perfect. No one's perfect. Paige, though, you shouldn't be that braggy. I hear the NDP have infected Edmonton with their convention, so be careful where you're walking in Alberta this week.
It is in Edmonton, and there was a journalist aptly tweeted that it's not often that Ottawa journalists are jealous of their colleagues that get to go to Edmonton, but it's because it's patio season here. So that's the silver lining.
Man, Ottawa's in rough shape, let me tell you. Well, in a few moments, Paige and I are going to talk with Todd MacKay, our Prairie Director, to get a recap on the Saskatchewan provincial election, or as we call it, Bradwall Fest 2016. And then we're going to shift gears and chat with Matt Bufton of the Institute for Liberal Studies. We're going to talk corporate welfare. We're going to talk guaranteed annual incomes. And we're going to talk about the libertarian credentials of some of these Conservative Party of Canada leadership hopefuls, if any libertarian credentials. There's a couple of them who are trying to make hay on it, but sir, you are no Ron Paul, as they say. Lots of ways for people to connect with us. If you've joined us here live, you can make sure to subscribe to our feed to keep track of all our shows. You can comment in the sidebar. You can tweet us at the handles you see listed, at Jordan Bateman or at Paige McP. You can also type /Q in the chat and get added to our question queue. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation is a nonprofit, nonpartisan advocacy organization dedicated to three things: lower taxes, less waste, and more government accountability. That's what drives all the communications, research, and advocacy work we do. You can visit our website, taxpayer.com, see everything that Paige and Todd and I and the rest of the CTF team is working on. And if you're listening to this later as a podcast or recording, feel free to send us an email, bc.director@taxpayer.com. And we also post this to Facebook, facebook.com/taxpayer.com. We're everywhere, Matt. We're everywhere. Well, let's start with you, Todd. Your video's dropped off. I think your audio is still there. But Todd, let's run through the Saskatchewan election. I know it was a Sask party wipeout, 51 seats for Brad Wall, 63% of the vote. Cam Broughton, the NDP, 10 seats, 30%. And the Liberals, the natural governing party in this great nation, no seats, 3.6% of the vote. So what's your takeaway from this Saskatchewan election?
Yeah, this really was a campaign of change versus more of the same, and people liked the same. They had a lot. You just went over the results. The Sask party, this is their third election win in a row. The vote actually went up for them. They got higher percentage, knocked out the NDP opposition leader for the second time in a row. The leader lost their seat. That almost never happens. This is the first NDP or CCF government to win 3 times in a row. This is the worst the NDP has ever done since its first election in 1938. So this is huge in terms of we all like watching the horse races. This is a hell of a horse race, a win in a sense here. It's a blowout. But one of the really interesting takeaways from this one, I was actually going to do a spending tracker because in most elections, the promises go like crazy. They're bidding for your votes with your money. So we like to keep a tab on that. How much is this going to cost you for all the money they're paying for your vote? And it was really interesting. We actually didn't end up doing the spending tracker because the Sask party made like 2 spending announcements, which were already factored into their budget plans. Their total campaign promise amount is about $100 million over 4 years, which is like 0.6% of their spending and already factored into their budget. So really, they promised nothing. And the NDP, they had some bigger money promises, but they also actually had big cuts in there as well. And some of them were probably a little bit hopeful, we'll put it that way. I'm not sure they would saved as much money as they thought they would, but they had some very, very common sense things like, hey, maybe we don't need 2 ministers handling healthcare. Let's shrink the size of cabinet. When you've got socialists talking about trimming the size of government, you've got a pretty fun debate going on in Saskatchewan. Now, we still got some issues here. Obviously, we're running a deficit right now. We need to get some of those things sorted out. But all in all, we've got some problems here, but I wouldn't trade our problems for the problems any of the rest of you guys have.
Well, BC were okay. BC were okay.
Yeah, BC is pretty good.
Yeah, that reminds me though of Christy Clark. So the BC premier in the last election in BC, Christy Clark lost her seat and then had to be parachuted into another riding in the Okanagan. And so there is that parallel there. But you're right, like that doesn't happen very often. What you said about the fact that they didn't have to make this laundry list of spending promises probably speaks to the Sask Party's popularity because I mean, that's such a common thing. I remember the federal Conservatives before the election came in here and into Calgary, made billions of dollars of spending announcement that just happened to pair up right before the election. But what about, I mean, look, I mean, I think that Brad Wall gets a lot of sort of conservative, small c conservative cred, but let's talk about his spending because this is an area that doesn't often get talked about, and he's a pretty big spender.
Paige, don't tug on Superman's cape.
Yeah. Well, you're going to get me in trouble here. You're going to get me run out of the province. Look, the debt's going up here. Now, we got to be very clear about the Sask Party and Premier Wall's record personally. When they first came into office, they paid down billions of dollars of debt. Like, it was incredible how much they dropped the debt. The problem is this year we're going to add about $1 billion to the taxpayer-supported debt, which is a bad thing. And per capita, and this is funny because we were just making fun of Premier Selinger's NDP government in Manitoba, but per capita, Saskatchewan's spending more money than Manitoba. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag. You know, some of the spending, a lot of it's focused on infrastructure. That's good. But at the end of the day, you can't spend more money than you have. And that's what's happening here. But on the other hand, there are some really good things. Like, for example, we've been pushing for a long time to get the government out of the liquor industry. I don't need the government's help to buy or sell a beer. This is something you see around the world. You can walk downtown Moscow and buy a beer without the government's help. This is a major part of the Sask Party's platform. It looks to me like they're going to move very aggressively on it. It's about time. So, you know, nobody's perfect. Premier Wall, despite his massive victory and a lot of really positive things, he's not perfect. They've got to get their spending under control. But I think one of the things that we saw in that election was there was actually a huge political liability to promising a lot of money. And both the NDP and the Sask Party understood that. They couldn't, if they went out and promised a lot of money, they were going to get hit with questions from the media and ourselves and others. How are you going to pay for this? They didn't have a good answer for that, so they didn't make big promises. So overall, I think that's a pretty positive thing.
Yeah, that's great.
Todd, you know, this you mentioned this is the lowest NDP vote since the dirty 30s. Are we seeing a cultural shift in Saskatchewan, you think, towards conservatism? Is it becoming a little bit more like what we picture in Alberta? Is that fair to say, or is this really specific to Brad Wall and the Sask Party in this moment in time?
It's a little bit of column A and a little column B. So first of all, I think the structure of the NDP has changed a lot. They don't get the volunteers they used to get. They don't get the door knockers. They were paying. They had ads on Kijiji to hire door knockers in this election. The Sask Party didn't do that. They had hundreds of people out door knocking ridings multiple times through, and they weren't paying anybody. I can tell you that for sure. So that's I think there's a structural issue, and I think the liquor issue is a good one to sort of illustrate this. They shouted, and their union supporters spent millions of dollars on ads opposing liquor retail. No, like I
Todd just froze it up.
Todd froze, but the passion is still there.
Todd, you froze up just as you were telling us about the millions of dollars in advertising. So,
can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, look, it was a hugely unsuccessful campaign in terms of blocking privatization. There's a real out-of-touch piece with where the NDP is right now. People do not care whether it's a government employee selling them a six-pack of beer or not. In fact, in Saskatchewan, they don't care whether it's a government employee replacing their hip or not. What we want is results, and rather than philosophy, and I think that's something where Premier Wall has tied into very well. But look, with all due respect to Cam Broughton and to the NDP and all that, there's not very many people in the country who could have beat him. I mean, he's just an unbelievable political talent. He's probably the best political orator that I've ever heard, for sure. Now, it doesn't mean he's perfect in all things policy, but he's an extraordinarily talented campaign. So, I think you got to give a little bit of a break to Cam Broughton and the NDP. Not many people could have beat these. To find yourself on the mat fight with him is probably a pretty understandable place to be.
Yeah, I watched the Saskatchewan leaders debate, and Broughton just looked like third-class talent compared to Wall. I mean, Broughton was trying everything, throwing everything at the wall to see what would stick, and Brad just back and forth. The other thing that Wall does that, I think he's actually probably the best political tweeter in the country, as far as like a politician tweeting.
Yeah. I was talking to a different stakeholder on a different issue the other day, and he had been talking to a major side bureaucrat, and he said, how do I get a message to Premier Wall about this policy issue? The guy's, well, just tweet at him. That'll probably work. And it's totally true. The Premier, it's a well-known secret in Saskatchewan. He looks at his own Twitter account. He's watching it all day, for good or ill. Sometimes he watches it very closely, and he is profoundly funny on it on a pretty regular basis.
Well, you feel like you get to know the guy, right? Like I feel like I know Brad Wall far better than I know, well, I mean, not Christy Clark, because obviously I've been following her for years here, but better than I know any other premier across the country. And I think I follow them all on Twitter. But you get to feel like you know him, his crazy rider fandom, which obviously Saskatchewan's a religion, his love of Graham DeLate, the golfer. You feel like you know the guy. And so, if he is contemplating a run for the Tory leadership, I think that's a big leg up.
As a retail politician, there's almost nobody better. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to say just his zingers. I mean, on Twitter, I'll always remember the one about, if we just maybe start putting equalization money in through a pipeline, then maybe, Eastern Canada will approve it. Like, that's a great line. He's got a lot of those great lines. I don't follow him as closely on Twitter, but I mean, when I see that kind of stuff, it goes absolutely viral, and his popularity actually even bleeds over into Alberta. I mean, I think that there was some disenfranchised partisan conservatives in the province when the NDP was elected, and there was sort of a viral sign of a billboard or one of those sort of letterboards that said Brad Wall for Premier of Alberta. So he's got a following out here as well. Like I have to repeat again that it's sort of similar to the PCs here in Alberta, where people, they have this kind of legacy of being very, very conservative, but they do spend a lot of money. I mean, Ralph Klein cut spending, but the PCs here do spend a lot of money. That's frustrating, I think, from a sort of nonpartisan perspective. Okay, we should expect better on this. But certainly he's got that cultural following down to a T.
Well, and actually, I'll just note something else that you're mentioning. The NDP in Alberta probably added about 10 points to Brad Wall's win as well. Mm-hmm. People here are watching that very, very closely, what's going on there. And you heard it on talk radio all the time. Folks, remember when you're voting, we don't want what happened in Alberta to happen here. And you know what? Some of it is obviously out of Premier Notley's control with oil and all that kind of stuff. But it did resonate across the border in a big way, and I think you have to factor that into the results.
Yeah, I mean, the huge deficits that we're running now, we're leading into our Alberta budget next week, looking at a probably $10.4 billion deficit, not including infrastructure spending. So probably going to be closer to $15 billion or more just in our deficit. The price of oil factors into that, but deficits are a policy choice. And so I think people in Saskatchewan probably recognize it.
Yeah, for sure.
Brad Wall's Alberta advantage. Okay, last question, Todd. When does Manitoba vote? I think you have the best job in the CTF, Todd, because you've got the tale of two provinces, right? You got Saskatchewan, which, despite its issues, generally doing the right things, and then Manitoba, which is a complete basket case and the almost Ontario-like in its craziness. What's happening there? And it seems like Salinger's going down to defeat.
Yeah, so in that election, they go to vote on the 19th. New polls just out have the PCs up at 50%. They're showing them leading in the city of Winnipeg. They're leading in NDP strongholds. The barring some huge unforeseen event, which, elections are living things, it certainly can happen. It looks like it's going to be a PC sweep. But here's the thing to keep in mind. Greg Salinger from the NDP in the last election promised not to raise the PST. Then he did it and raised the PST without any consultation with people, just forced that on him. And then despite all of that, continues to run massive deficits. The projected deficit for this year is $773 million. So even folks are taking it in the pocketbook in a bigger and bigger way through higher and higher taxes, they're getting further and further behind. The fact is, Premier Salinger has virtually no credibility with the media, with the voters, with anybody, and is showing up in a big way. Now, the Conservatives, it looks to me like they're going to win the election, but they're going to inherit a huge mess to clean up. This is going to be a difficult situation for them. They promised to cut the PST back. That's good. They've promised to deal with bracket creep, something that we've also asked for. They're going to have referendums before major tax increases. All great stuff, but they have to balance the budget. They're going to have to make very tough decisions to do that. So we often look at the end of the election as the end of something, but really it's the beginning of something. It's the beginning of turning things around. It's going to be a tough ride, and it'll be interesting to see how Brian Pallister and his team goes about tackling that.
When the Liberals came to power here in BC in 2001, they were greatly advantaged by the fact they had 77 of the 79 seats. It was a complete rejection of NDP policies. Mm-hmm. And I remember sitting with a Liberal organizer that night, and he looked at me and said, well, it's all downhill from here. And, they could lose 25 seats in the next election because of hard decisions and still hold a majority. So, if Pallister is running up the numbers, even in places like Winnipeg, that's really interesting.
Well, I think one of the things it really speaks to is that a lot of people, even though they work for the government or have loved ones who work for the government and those kind of folks, people that are often the targets of the fear tactics in terms of, you're going to lose your job, they're going to cut everything and all that kind of stuff. Even people for whom that would be a most powerful argument, even though people are recognizing the situation in Manitoba is so bad, we've got to do the hard work, we've got to make the tough decisions to make it happen, or it's only going to get worse. So it's one of those things. On one hand, it's a bad news story because Manitoba is in very tough shape. But it's a good news story in that they recognize they have a problem, and that's the first step to recovery in all of these sorts of things. You've got to admit you've got a problem. And Manitoba looks like they're going to admit very honestly and profoundly that they've got a big problem.
That puts them a mile ahead of Ontario, for example. Hey, Todd. Right. Great work, as always. Looking forward to following the @CutThePST campaign, @CutThePST on Twitter, seeing Fibber, our mascot around Manitoba, plaguing candidates, trying to get them to promise to cut the PST. So you're doing great work, and thanks for the update.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me.
Awesome.
Paige, why don't you introduce Matt? Let's talk some libertarianism.
Okay, this is awesome. So I'm excited about this. Excited to have Matt Bufton. They're in our little top corner next to Jordan. He is the executive director of the Institute for Liberal Studies. That's basically Canada's libertarian organization. They're kind of like the Liberty Authority in Canada. So I'll give you a little bit of a background on Matt. Matt co-founded the Institute for Liberal Studies in 2006 and has served as the executive director since 2010. He's responsible for the day-to-day management of the ILS, handles administration, fundraising, strategic direction for the Institute, and also plans and oversees all their activities across Canada. And they are quite active across Canada. They do lots of student outreach in particular, and just sort of a lot of just ideas sharing, which is cool, right? Organizations that are dedicated to sort of the business of ideas are always very cool. So Matt graduated from the University of Windsor's Odette School of Business, the Atlas Network's Think Tank Leadership Academy, another cool organization, the Atlas Foundation, that people can check out, US-based. He's spoken at conferences across Canada and the US. He currently serves on the board of directors of Civitas, which is another cool organization here in Canada, sort of a small C conservative / libertarian ideas-based organization. I know Matt would get mad at me if I had just said small C conservative and not libertarian. So a little bit of background on the Institute for Liberal Studies. Like I said, nonpartisan, educational nonprofit. They host seminars, lectures, events, conferences to spread the ideas of liberty in Canada. They address classical liberal perspective with an emphasis on economic and political freedom. Last year, just to give you a little bit of an idea, the ILS hosted 30 events across Canada, attended by over 1,000 people. So the ideas are really spreading. They have an event coming up this summer called Freedom Week, and I want to remind people of that and tell them about what's happening at the end of this podcast so that they have the good takeaway there. But Matt is joining us today to sort of shed some perspective on, first of all, what the heck is libertarianism? How does it apply to some of the big policy ideas that we talk about in our society? So, for example, corporate welfare, subsidies to business, guaranteed annual income. That's something that, for example, Mayor Nenshi here in Calgary talks about. We're going to talk about that idea. And then we're also going to talk about the Conservative Party leadership candidates. Some of them are throwing around this word libertarian, and we're going to hold that up to sort of a libertarian purist and see how much cred those ideas actually have. So after that very long introduction, Matt, how are you doing today? Oh, Matt's frozen. How are you doing? I think we're good now.
I'm back, but if you asked a question, I missed it.
Okay, I just asked how you were doing. That's all.
Oh, I'm doing great, thank you. Aside from the snow here in Ottawa, not too bad.
Yeah, that sucks. Yeah, no way around that. So let's start out with why don't you give us sort of a primer on what exactly is libertarianism? How does that apply as sort of a philosophy that somebody might have to sort of guide their political thinking, guide their life choices, and that kind of stuff?
Yeah. Well, so libertarianism is, and libertarian is sort of an awkward constructed word. And the reason we're stuck with it is because about 100 years ago, the progressive movement stole the word liberal. So that's why we're the Institute for Liberal Studies rather than the Institute for Conservative Studies or Libertarian Studies, is that the liberal political tradition is one that places a lot of importance on liberty, both.
Oh, Matt's frozen again.
Both in the civil.
All right. Are you back? All right. I'm going to share.
Locke and J.S. Mill and Adam Smith.
The connection's not great. Sorry. So you were talking about how liberal sort of was taken by the movement. But you used the word liberal. So talk about maybe a little bit. Yeah.
Yes.
Just rewind for a second there.
Sure. Yeah, sorry about that. So yeah, the word liberal originally was used to describe thinkers like Adam Smith and John Locke and Frederick Bastiat and people like that who placed a big importance on liberty, which is the root word of the word liberal. Early 20th century, that word sort of changes and becomes associated with people who want bigger government, which certainly I and a lot of other people associate with less liberty. So it's a bit ironic there. But so libertarian is the word that the sort of people who wanted to continue in that tradition of focusing on markets, on individualism, entrepreneurship.
Having a little bit of technical difficulties. I have a Liberty fun fact. This is about actually in Canada about so if we think about maybe who the most libertarian prime minister is in Canada and who's I guess the most freedom oriented prime minister would be in Canada and Canadian history, I find that a lot of libertarians will tell me that it was actually Laurier, and Laurier was a liberal, a big L liberal. So maybe a party that today people think associate with a little bit of maybe bigger government, but actually at the time, and I think this is true, is probably actually our most freedom-oriented prime minister. So the Liberal Party of Canada even has a lot of sort of freedom-oriented roots, maybe going back to that sort of original meaning of liberty that Matt was talking about.
Nice history lesson, Paige. That's good.
Well, last time I was in Ottawa, I actually attended an event on Laurier, and I think it's true. I mean, he's kind of my favorite prime minister in Canadian history, and I think that he did contribute to that movement. I'm really interested to see what Matt is going to have to say, though, about the current Conservative Party leadership candidates. We do hear this word libertarian thrown around. I've heard some sort of television hosts identify as libertarian. I've heard politicians identify as libertarian. Yeah. I don't think anybody, including them in many cases, actually knows exactly what that means, but maybe it kind of just sounds good. It sounds maybe less less, I don't want to say, I mean, it doesn't have the connotations that sort of the big C conservative has with it. So I think that's why maybe a lot of them identify as such.
Yeah, I mean, I think Maxime Bernier is the guy who's gets this tag thrown around the most, although kind of perplexingly, to be honest, I don't see a lot of libertarian views coming from Bernier, but I'm hoping Matt can rejoin. There's Matt.
Sorry about that.
No worries. It's the interwebs. The man's trying to keep you down, Matt.
Well, we have Bell because we have a no choice. There's a monopoly provision on internet in our building, so I'm going to blame that.
I bet you if you had competition, you could get a better signal.
That would be nice.
Yeah. So Paige was telling us about Laurier, and then
we lost them again.
Oh, man.
Okay, this is, I think, a good opportunity for me to, while we try and work out our technical difficulties, tell everybody about Freedom Week, which the Institute for Liberal Studies is actually putting on. These are events that happen in, I believe that there's 2 of them, and they happen in the summer, and it's sort of the flagship Institute for Liberal Studies event. It's a 5-day seminar that gives students and recent graduates the in-depth exposure to classical liberal tradition through lectures and discussions. So it's, again, just sort of one of these ideas sharing conferences where they talk about these big ideas, they bring in speakers, and they kind of teach students what libertarianism is all about. This year, Freedom Week seminars will be held at Simon Fraser University in July, so out in your neck of the woods, Jordan, and in McGill in Montreal in August. Matt, I'm just telling everybody about Freedom Week. So there's no cost to attend, but interested students have to apply by April 15th, so quite soon, if you do want to get in on that. So you've got a week to apply for Freedom Week, and I think you can go to the Institute for Liberal Studies website in order to do that and find out more information. And it really is cool. I mean, actually, so my background as a student was I helped start sort of one of the first libertarian campus clubs in Canada when I was in university, and these exposure to these ideas I think really shaped my idea of how how government really needs to be accountable. Government needs to be transparent. Government doesn't always need to grow and grow and grow and grow, and that can be applied to the tax burden as well. You don't always have to be continuing to grow the size of government spending, grow the size of the tax burden onto the backs of people. So these sort of ideas and the history that Matt is talking about and the people who shape these ideas historically, are really, they're good. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, if you're interested in tax issues, if you're interested in issues of government transparency and accountability, the ILS is a really good organization to just try and go and sort of, broaden your horizons and attend one of their events.
Yeah, absolutely. Modern libertarianism, I think, is tied a lot to our view of the U.S. politics and Ron Paul specifically. And then, Rand trying to run in this cycle, but obviously not having the same kind of purity, probably is the best word for it, as Ron Paul did.
Libertarian cred.
Yeah. And libertarians, I actually did a master's in leadership studies at Royal Roads recently, and our boss, Troy Lanigan, the president of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, he would identify himself as a libertarian. So I looked a little bit about how that permeates us as an organization, because libertarians, sort of famously, independent, individual, all of that kind of thing. For Troy, obviously that affects the way we as an organization run. So really interesting to see that. Matt, you're back. Matt, let's cut to the good stuff here. Max Bernier, libertarian or a faux libertarian?
Well, I think personally he's a real libertarian. I think that's more of a question of how would he govern? How has he voted in the past? And I think while he certainly did a few good things, especially as industry minister in the early years of the Harper government, he was able to get some good positive deregulation passed and things like that. And that's where he sort of developed a lot of his libertarian following. But then starting once he sort of became Minister of Foreign Affairs, there's not much he can really do in that portfolio that would be all that libertarian. And then he was on the backbenches. Actually, while he was on the backbenches, he was going around the country making a lot of speeches that certainly appealed to libertarians. But then he got put back in cabinet. When you're in cabinet, you have cabinet solidarity. You can't disagree. You have to vote with the government. And that's the sort of stuff where I think we really didn't see very much going on there. And then the late days of the campaign, I believe he even gave a press conference where he spoke out in favor of supply management, which is something a lot of libertarians oppose, which is sort of a limit on the production of milk and dairy in Canada that tends to drive up prices in favor of consumers favor producers to the disadvantage of consumers. And so the question that I'm interested in is not, is Maxime Bernier a libertarian? Because I think he is. His question is he going to present a libertarian platform? And that was where I was sort of disappointed yesterday at his conference. He was asked a question about marijuana legalization, which he gave a bit of a squishy answer and said, well, I want to read the legislation. And then he was asked about supply management. And he said, I'll talk about that later. I'm not going to talk about that now. So there wasn't any sort of red policy meat there for a libertarian to get excited about.
Right. This is so common when it comes to politicians. I mean, you know, you kind of say like, oh no, I know he really is a small c conservative, you know, and I know that's going to guide his principles, and he really is a libertarian, and I know that's going to guide his principles. I'm like, I feel like saying to people and, you know, partisans who sort of buy into this stuff and kind of convince themselves of it often, like, demand better. Demand good ideas. Good ideas are important, right? Good ideas lead to good policy. You should be demanding that they actually are willing to come out in favor of those policies. So are there any other conservative leadership candidates that you think are showing any leadership or libertarian cred, maybe any sort of people who've been talked about as potential candidates?
If you say Michael Chong, Matt Bufton, this conversation is over.
I'm not going to mention anyone else who was involved in the Harper administration, the Harper government that did a lot of things that I disagreed with. If I had to pick someone else, and I don't think he's going to run, but the person I would pick would actually be Kevin O'Leary, and he certainly seems to have an understanding that regulation is harmful, that markets produce a great deal of wealth, and although he's being likened to Donald Trump a bit, this was specifically brought up at the Manning conference here in Ottawa a month or two ago, and he sort of really went out of his way to say, I'm pro-immigration, I'm pro-trade. So I think he might be maybe the other sort of maybe libertarian in the race, but if you have to ask me, I don't think he'll officially get in.
Right. Interesting. Okay. Yeah. It's going to be an interesting race. I mean, I like leadership races because you do see a great deal, generally more discussion of ideas than you see when people are actually in government or actually in opposition, where sort of the narrative is dominated. So let's talk about maybe some of those ideas. There's an idea that's been floated here in Calgary by Mayor Nenji called the guaranteed annual income. Can you maybe break down for us, like, what exactly is the guaranteed annual income first, and then we can get into maybe the feasibility of it?
Yeah, absolutely. This is really cool because it's something that's taking place both in the media and the popular discourse, but also among the more academic libertarian circles. So the idea is that if you look at, we have a lot of programs that are designed to take money from one group of people and give it to another group of people in Canada. If you were to add up all of those programs between your province and the federal government and in your city, you're probably looking in the hundreds and maybe the thousands of different programs all doing this. And if you add up the amount of money that's being moved back and forth, you can see that it's a pretty high number. I don't have a specific number, but it's often a number that if you look at it, you say, well, if everybody just had that money, then they wouldn't be poor. So the government is spending, say, $25,000 to try and give someone $15,000 to try and get them out of poverty. And you think, well, if you just gave them the $25,000, they'd probably at least be the poverty line, at least if they're a single individual. And so the idea behind the guaranteed annual income is rather than government providing a lot of services to the poor, that they would actually just give them money. And the best thing, and this is something I do believe, the best thing you can do for a poor person is give them money, not give them programs, because the programs will tend to be designed by people who may not understand the situation. They'll tend to be run very bureaucratically. They won't have competitive feedback mechanisms that are how we know how private businesses are good and bad, because they can go to business. The government welfare office or unemployment office never goes out of business. So yeah, the guaranteed income is a proposal to give everybody a chunk of money in place of all these inefficient programs.
But what about, which member of parliament was it that said, oh, but they're going to spend it on beer and popcorn? If we give money directly to people, to I guess, low income people, are going to spend it on beer and popcorn.
That was not a member of Parliament, although he shares a name with a member of Parliament. It was Scott Reid, the Liberal strategist.
Oh, right. Yes. He does share a name with a member of Parliament. That's why I was thinking that. Yes. So what about that? I mean, people can't be trusted with their own money. What?
That's a paternalistic attitude that I think is pretty broadly shared between a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people on all sides of the political spectrum. So it's not a liberal, it's not a conservative or an NDP, although you may have stronger strains in some parties than others. But a lot of people think that, you can't trust these people; they're going to make bad decisions. And I think the problem is they're looking sometimes at people and saying, well, they're not spending the money the way that I would spend it. So we need to, and I'm not poor, I'm not in poverty, so I can make their life better by telling them how they should, what they should buy and what they should have. And the problem is that everybody's unique, and so it's a pretty core part of the libertarian or classical liberal worldviews to have a respect for autonomy and want people and believe that people will generally make better choices for themselves than others will make for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great point. It's so frustrating, I think, when people say that. So okay, I like the idea. I mean, it's a cool idea. It would certainly reduce administrative costs. I mean, of all of the different, you're talking about these hundreds or thousands of programs. I mean, there's got to be some duplication in there. There's so many. The cost to staff these programs, I mean, that would probably reduce spending overall if we were to replace all these programs with a guaranteed annual income. But is that likely? I mean, was that something we could actually feasibly expect to see, let's say, in the city of Calgary, for example, where Mayor Nenshi is floating this idea?
Well, so my problem, and again, I support the guaranteed income as sort of a theory, and a lot of libertarians have talked about this. I think the problem comes down into to execution, and so sort of a libertarian support for a guaranteed income, and this is by no means universal among libertarians. I have lots of libertarian friends who wouldn't support this under any means, but the ones who would support it tend to think that it's a replacement for all of these social programs. So the idea is we have this huge list of programs, we look through them, pretty much anything that's redistributing income, and we say we're going to get rid of those and give people money and the ability to make their own decisions, and we think that'll be more effective in getting them out of poverty. And that's a position I agree with. In my case, I would not just limit that to things like welfare, but pensions, which are supposed to give money to seniors. Well, not all seniors need money. Some are poor and some are rich. And I think if we're going to have government give money to seniors, it should be because they're poor and not because they're old. And I would go right down to healthcare and education. That I view a minimum guaranteed income as saying, all right, we're going to give you money so that kids will be able to go to school, but you're going to be spending that money to send them to school. Same with healthcare. Okay, we're not going to have a government healthcare, universal healthcare. We're going to have private hospitals and nonprofit hospitals and insurance programs, and you're going to use the money we give you to spend on those things. And I think the consensus, whatever consensus you might be able to build initially around a guaranteed income, will fall apart as soon as we say we're going to get rid of public schools and public healthcare.
The big problem with the guaranteed income from where I sit is that, well, first of all, I'm not sure how we get past the idea that we're redistributing income. And I imagine that's probably the number one concern of many of your, or the libertarians on the other side of the issue. But I just don't trust government to ratchet down anything. Like, they'll never get rid of welfare. They'll not get rid of VI, and we'll end up paying for everything twice, which means higher taxes and more debt. Exactly, and there's a strong. Milton Friedman was an advocate for a form of minimum income, and his preferred structure was as a negative income tax, which would mean that as you filed your income tax return, if you made no money, you would get some money, and then as you earned more, the amount they gave you would get less, and then at a certain point, you would start to pay in rather than drawing out. And there was discussions at the U.S. congressional level in the 1970s, and he was pushing for this proposal. But then when he realized that the politicians were only going to take half of his recommendation, they were going to implement this negative income tax, but also keep all these other programs, then he reversed his support, because he said this is only a good idea if we're going to get rid of all these other things. And like you, I wouldn't trust most politicians to do that.
Yeah, I apologize. My dog is barking in the background. But I want to talk about, if we can switch gears for just a second, I want to talk about corporate welfare. So at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we talk a lot about corporate welfare. what's the libertarian opinion when it comes just sort of broadly on subsidies, government handouts to business?
Oh, you frozen?
Oh,
there you go.
I'm back now. So I lost Paige for a minute, but I heard you asking what's the libertarian position on corporate welfare. Yeah, no, I think we should get rid of all of them. There's not a single case where I can think of that we need to do this. This is actually another form of that redistribution, right? So one that's been talked about lately is money for Bombardier. And if we do that, what that means is we're taking money from everyone and we're giving it to people who might work at Bombardier or be shareholders in Bombardier. And so we're giving those people money and from everyone else. There's no such thing as free money. And I think if you look at the government track record of picking which companies to invest in, the argument is right that these are strategic investments. And so the government gives someone $1 billion, but it creates $2 billion. And I just don't think the evidence holds that up. I'm from Windsor.
Oh, we froze again. I know he's going to talk about the auto bailouts. Oh, are you back, Matt?
People at the car companies. Sorry, where did I leave off?
So
you were just saying you were from Windsor.
Okay. And there's car companies there that have taken a lot of money from governments, and yet they employ fewer people. So we've been, the government, Canadian people, have been giving corporate welfare to these car companies, and in return, they've been employing fewer and fewer people. Now, I don't fault them for employing fewer people. That's a result of trade and technology. But I do fault them for asking for money, and I really fault the government for giving it to them.
So what would be this sort of, is there a sort of a philosophical underpinning to that from a libertarian perspective as why we shouldn't be sort of handing out? Because a lot of people would say to you, oh, but we need these jobs. I mean, these jobs are important. And not only that, there's some kind of a pseudo-economic argument that can be made, because if we give these people jobs, then these people will have money. They can spend that money in the economy. That means that, spending is going to generate growth and economic activity. So is there some kind of, first of all, I guess what's your response to that? But is there some sort of a philosophical underpinning as well that sort of defines your view on this?
Yeah, so to the first point, obviously I disagree with the idea that this will generate more economic growth than the alternative, which is not to not have money spent, but to have individuals choosing how to spend smaller amounts of money rather than governments choosing to spend a big amount of money, right? So Bombardier, they could get $1 billion for government, or you could leave $10 or $20 in the pockets of every Canadian. And those little decisions would support lots of businesses across the country and would go disproportionately to the businesses that provided value and wouldn't go to the businesses that didn't. In terms of the intellectual underpinnings, one way to sort of think about it is the debate between two economic figures and their followers, one being John Maynard Keynes and the other being Friedrich Hayek. And if anybody hasn't seen the Hayek Keynes rap videos, I highly recommend it. It sounds really nerdy, but they're actually really well.
It's awesome.
The musical quality is far above what you're expecting if you haven't seen this and what you're imagining. There's two of them. The first one on YouTube has, I believe, over 5 million views, and the other is pushing 3 million. So a lot of people have watched this, and it sort of describes the general competing ideas here. And Keynes takes the view that the government needs to stimulate economy and target those investments, and that they'll get the best results by doing so. And Hayek takes the view of a sort of decentralized economy, that the economy isn't run by the government at the top pushing decisions down. See, now I've got my I Love Hayek button on here, but it's run by people at the bottom, and that knowledge filters up. And so there's lines in that video about how capitalism depends on profit and loss. If you bail out the losers, there's no end to the cost. And so the point is that in a capitalist system, some people will lose money and go out of business. And while it may be sad for those people, it's a better system in the long run, because they'll find new jobs where they actually create value for people, rather than being stuck in jobs that probably won't be that fulfilling, and they'll be insecure because they're not sure what's going on, and they'll be relying on government handouts to keep them going.
So, Matt, you maybe weren't super nerdy for mentioning the rap, but for knowing the line in the rap, I have to say, that's pretty nerdy.
And you're guilty as charged.
I'll take that as a compliment.
So I put the wrap actually in our little live chat section next where you guys see the typing. So if anybody wants to watch it, the link is there. The reason that, I wanted to ask about corporate welfare is because this has become it's coming back in Alberta. This was a big issue in Alberta in the 1970s and 80s. We wasted billions of dollars. We invested in trying to diversify our economy. We invested in like a meat company. We invested in an airline, sort of went all over the place. Like you name it, the Alberta government invested in it, and we ended up wasting billions. We're sort of revisiting this idea, but I think it's going to be specifically with diversification, sort of these sort of oil refining projects and green energy projects, which are sort of linked in with this carbon tax that we have coming down the pipe. Ironic wording, coming down the pipe. So what do you think about that? I mean, because there's another argument that can be made for these kind of green energy subsidies. Oh, but it's good for the environment. We're doing so much good with this. What do you say to corporate welfare, in those cases?
Yeah, it certainly, there's a tempting and maybe seductive element to those things of not only are we investing in jobs, but we're getting a cleaner source of energy, because we can see that there's pollution if we put oil in a car or we're next to a coal plant or factory that's burning lots of fossil fuels and that sort of stuff. And one of the lessons about economics is there's no such thing as a free lunch. So if you're creating emissions to do something in one way, chances are you can't just stop creating those emissions. And what you get with energy often is you can move around where that takes place. So a good example would be an electric car, which some people are really big on. If you use a conventional gasoline-powered car, then the pollution is taking place where you are. So the emissions coming out of your tailpipe, and it's very visible. If you're using an electric car, it might be tempting to think you plug it in, there's no smoke, there's no emissions, it's very clean. But that electric car relies on some sort of electricity generating activity taking place somewhere else. Now, that might be a coal plant or a natural gas plant, in which case the emissions are there. But it could be like a solar plant or a windmill or something. And then that seems like, well, then there's no emissions. But there's still a lot of resources going into that. If it's solar, then you've got lots of chemicals and mining that has to take place to create those cells. If it's a windmill, you've got to build these massive turbines and then ship them around the world from where they're made to where they want to be. So there's always going to be, basically, resources are being used and consumed in the creation of any sort of energy. And it can be hard to tell how many resources are being used to produce any one thing. Fortunately, we have this sort of shorthand to give us an idea, and that's prices. So if you go to the store and something costs $1, then probably it didn't need many resources. If it costs $10,000, probably a lot of resources were used. And the Green Energy Act is sort of this, we have one in Ontario that's cost consumers billions and billions of dollars under the idea that we're sort of getting this free lunch. And what we're doing is offsetting the costs to encourage people to produce solar and wind energy. And we're sort of ignoring or not looking too carefully at the massive amounts of resources that are being used to produce energy in that way.
That's a great point. So I think we're kind of getting to the end here, but I want to give you the opportunity to give your website and where information about Freedom Week. I told people it's a 5-day seminar, students and recent graduates. There's one going to happen in BC, one happening in Montreal, and you have a week left to apply. Matt, how can they apply for it?
Absolutely. Go to liberalstudies.ca or just Google Liberal Studies Freedom Week. You'll find information on our website, including an application that might take you 15 or 20 minutes. The seminars are totally free. They're designed for students and recent graduates between 18 and 29. It's a real experience for people who want to just spend a lot of time talking about people who really care about ideas. We center that in a discussion based in classical liberal and libertarian ideas, but we take a lot of students who aren't libertarians because we want a conversation, not just a bunch of nodding going on. As you say, April 15th is the deadline, and the only cost for the students who take part and are accepted is travel to either Vancouver or Calgary. Once they get there, there's no registration fee, and we pay for meals, we pay for accommodations, and even evening socials.
Okay, awesome. Well, that was great.
Yeah, it was
Thank
awesome. Hey, and let me put in a plug too for liberalstudies.ca. These folks obviously rely on donations from people like us. If you've liked what you've heard today, if you want to see more about liberty, especially at the campus level, I mean, this is where we can start to talk to kids early and start to deprogram a bit from what they receive from a lot of their college university professors. go to liberalstudies.ca, kick in some dough, and support these guys because they're doing a great job.
And we'll give you a tax receipt so you pay less tax.
Oh, there you go. There you go. Well, that's it for this episode of Tax Talk from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Be sure to follow Paige on Twitter at Paige MacP, follow Matt at liberal_studies, or follow me at Jordan Bateman. If you're watching this on Blab, be sure to subscribe to our feed. Give us some props, especially Matt, because he really he suffered through some technical glitches here, and he persevered. Thank you for that, Matt, and also to our listeners for hanging with us. If you're listening to this on iTunes, please subscribe and give us a good rating. Paige, you're not going to believe it. We were 12th this week in the government organization's iTunes podcast store. We have surpassed PETA.
Oh, it happened. The day has come. We have surpassed PETA.
Yeah, it's all because of the dog. It's because of your puppy. It brings in the PETA people, and we're like double dipping.
We blend their audience.
So we're blending, exactly. Well, you can check out our website as well at taxpayer.com, and be sure to join us again next week, Friday, April 15th, 9 a.m. Pacific, noon Eastern. Paige and I will be back, and it looks like we're going to have a guest from Uber. So we'll talk about some of the brewing battles across the country as Uber tries to shake up the taxi cartels and transform the way we move around cities. So Uber here next week, hopefully. Otherwise, Paige and I will be here talking taxes with another great guest. So thanks, everyone, for tuning in. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you.